The shed had stood behind the house for as long as the homeowner could remember, but he never thought much about it until the morning he found the envelope pinned to his front door. It was plain but official-looking, with the stark emblem of the newly formed Homeowners Association stamped across the top. He had known an HOA was coming. There had been meetings, flyers, and vague warnings about community improvements, but he assumed their reach would be limited to the usual nuisances: lawn height, trash bins, maybe complaints about holiday decorations. He never imagined they would take an interest in his backyard, let alone the old wooden shed that had weathered decades of storms, repairs, and the inevitable creep of nature. The first shock came from reading the letter's tone, firm and decisive, outlining a list of violations supposedly discovered during an assessment walk. At the top of that list was the shed, described as an unauthorized structure that disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic and allegedly violated updated zoning guidelines. The letter set a 30-day deadline for removal, with escalating fines if he failed to comply. Despite living on his property for years without incident, he found himself staring at a threat that carried the weight of legal action and community scrutiny. He walked to the backyard to look at the shed anew, as though seeing it through the strained lens of the HOA. Weathered planks lined its exterior, each one aged into a silvery tone from years of sun and rain. Moss trickled along the foundation stones, and an old padlock still held the door closed. It was nothing fancy, more practical than pretty, but it was part of the property's identity, part of its history. He had always assumed it came with the house, but he realized he didn't actually know when it was built. Records from the previous owner were sparse, and he'd never questioned any of it. What mattered was that the shed had always been there, and he had never imagined it could become a target. Even so, he knew HOAs loved to flex their authority, especially newly formed ones trying to establish legitimacy. They targeted easy marks first: fences an inch too tall, mailboxes in the wrong shade of beige, or garden beds that dared to be unconventional. A shed, particularly an old one, was a perfect test of power. If they could force one homeowner to bend, others would follow without question. And so the letter, with its sharp phrasing and thinly veiled threats, was their attempt at establishing dominance. He spent the rest of the morning reading the HOA bylaws, scrolling through digital copies of neighborhood documents, and trying to understand how a shed that predated the association could suddenly fall under its jurisdiction. The rules were written with broad strokes, packed with terms like visual cohesion and aesthetic standards, but nothing clearly defined the HOA's authority over structures that existed before its creation. The deeper he read, the more he realized the language was carefully crafted but far from airtight. HOAs relied less on precision and more on intimidation. They counted on homeowners never questioning their claims. By noon, he had a plan forming. He didn't want to jump into battle blindly. He needed evidence, history, something that could anchor the shed firmly in time. If he could prove it was older than the HOA itself, or even older than the neighborhood's modern zoning, he would have grounds to push back. The letter referenced violations under updated community guidelines, but guidelines meant nothing if the shed predated the very concept of enforcement. He needed documentation, something irrefutable. He drove to the county recorder's office that same afternoon. The building was cold, sterile, and filled with rows of metal filing cabinets that hummed faintly under fluorescent lights. He filled out a request form for historic records tied to his property, expecting a slow process and minimal help. But to his surprise, the office kept detailed archives of land plats, building permits, and property transfers dating back more than 50 years. A clerk handed him a stack of dusty folders containing maps, deeds, and handwritten notes from decades past, each one an echo of the land's long history. Sorting through the documents felt like piecing together a puzzle. Early maps showed the land as part of a larger agricultural parcel, long before suburban housing developments took over. Later maps revealed the subdivision plans, plotting out the streets and cul-de-sacs that would eventually form the neighborhood. Yet what caught his attention most was a shaded square drawn on an older plat map, small, tucked in the corner of the backyard, and marked simply as existing structure. The map was dated nearly 20 years before the HOA documents existed. The discovery sent a ripple of excitement through him, but he needed more than a map. He dug deeper into the records, flipping through pages of permits and surveys until he found a document that nearly made him stop breathing. A property survey signed by a contractor dated decades prior, detailing the house, the land boundaries, and the shed itself. The shed wasn't just old. It was officially documented as part of the property long before anyone imagined forming an HOA. With this confirmation, a shift began inside him. What started as anxiety and frustration transformed into something steadier, a sense of resolve. The HOA had been confident enough to demand removal, assuming no one would challenge them, but he now held proof that undermined their authority entirely. The shed was not a violation. It was heritage. He took photos of the documents, scanned them, and organized everything into a folder before leaving the recorder's office. The ride home felt different, like he had crossed an invisible threshold. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, the houses sterile under the late afternoon sun, each one subject to the HOA's tightening grip. But he felt insulated by the knowledge that he possessed something stronger than the HOA's empty threats. Evidence, history, and time itself. Back home, he stood again in front of the shed. The wood creaked softly as wind pushed against it, and he noticed details he'd never paid attention to before. The old beams, the way the stone foundation was set, and the faint markings from a carpenter who must have built it long before the neighborhood was paved over. It was more than storage. It was a survivor of a past era, a remaining fragment of a land that once knew fewer rules and more freedom. The HOA might have thought of it as an eyesore, but now, knowing what he knew, he saw it as a symbol of resilience. They had handed him a challenge, and he wasn't going to let them bulldoze his rights. Not when the shed had outlived entire boards, presidents, and maybe even some of the oldest homes nearby. As evening settled and the sky dimmed, he gathered all the documents he had collected and laid them out across his kitchen table. He reviewed every page carefully, highlighting key dates and details. He was preparing not just a response to the HOA, but the first move in what promised to be a much larger confrontation. The HOA had woken something stubborn in him, and they were about to learn that history doesn't bow to newly printed bylaws. By the time he finished organizing his notes, night had fully claimed the neighborhood. But his work was far from over. The shed had a story, and he intended to tell it with the full weight of evidence behind him. The HOA thought they could intimidate him into compliance, but they had miscalculated. The next step would determine everything. Delivering his findings directly to the board and watching their confidence crack under the undeniable truth. And as he prepared for that encounter, a storm was quietly building. One that would sweep through the HOA, the neighborhood, and everything in between. Morning arrived with an air of stillness, but beneath that quiet the homeowner felt a tension building. It was the day he planned to confront the HOA board with the evidence he had gathered, and though he'd spent the night preparing, there was something unsettling about stepping into their territory. The board prided itself on order, on appearances, on intimidating anyone who didn't fall neatly into compliance. But today, for the first time since the HOA's formation, someone was walking in armed with more than polite acquiescence. He carried facts, history, and the kind of documentation he knew would topple their hastily constructed authority. He printed multiple copies of the old survey, the plat map, and the archival notes from the county recorder's office. Each document felt like a shield, a counterweight to the threat the HOA had tried to impose. The neighborhood seemed ordinary as he drove toward the community center. Just rows of identical houses, each pressed close together as though conformity were a requirement of the land itself. But behind those facades were homeowners who had already begun whispering about rising fines, new regulations, and board members who seemed a little too eager to control every inch of the neighborhood. He knew people were watching as he stepped out of his car. Not visibly, not openly, but with the cautious curiosity that circulates through communities governed by rules. Word of his shed dispute had already trickled through a few neighbors, carried by the eager gossip of those who thrived on HOA drama. If he succeeded today, word would spread even faster. And if he failed, well, the HOA would use him as an example. The community center's meeting room was stark, its fluorescent lights harsh against the folding tables arranged in a U-shape. At the center sat the HOA president, a figure known for her stern posture and unwavering belief in the board's authority. Beside her were the rest of the board members, each equipped with clipboards, binders, and the false confidence that came with believing they had the final say in everything. Their expressions held a blend of boredom and expectation, as though they had already decided the outcome before he even walked in. But he took his seat calmly, placing the folder of documents directly in front of him. The room felt cold, but he reminded himself that facts don't shiver. Facts stand firm. The meeting began with the usual rote recitations. Approval of last month's minutes, budget updates, neighborhood improvement proposals. He waded through all of it, steady and silent, until the moment the president addressed his violation. She recited the claim with the certainty of someone who expected compliance. The shed, she said, must be removed. It lacked approval. It failed to meet current aesthetic guidelines, posed a potential liability, and the deadline remained unchanged. Only then did he slide his folder across the table. The shift in energy was immediate. Papers rustled. Board members leaned forward. The president's eyebrows drew together, not in concern but confusion. As she scanned the old survey with its precise measurements and clearly printed date, years before the HOA even existed, her posture faltered ever so slightly. It was subtle, but he saw it. The first crack in their facade. He explained the origins of the documents, how the shed's existence was recorded long before the community adopted modern zoning and even before many of the houses were built. The plat map, with its shaded square marking an existing structure, spoke louder than any argument he could have made. The county registrar's certification cemented its legitimacy. The HOA had no standing to demand removal, no authority over something older than the organization itself. The board exchanged glances. They were used to issuing rules, not receiving rebuttals backed by evidence. For the first time, their power felt uncertain. They whispered among themselves, flipping pages, trying to find a loophole in the very history he had laid before them. But history is not something easily rewritten. The president attempted to regain control by referencing updated guidelines, but the documents had made it clear, guidelines could not override grandfathered structures, especially not one documented so thoroughly. Every argument she attempted fell flat against the weight of the evidence. He could sense the frustration around the table, the rising awareness that they had overstepped. It wasn't just a miscalculation, it was an embarrassment for a board still trying to prove its effectiveness to the neighborhood. He watched as they deliberated, their confidence slowly unraveling. The minutes dragged on, punctuated only by the flipping of pages and the muffled hum of the overhead lights. Board members began to realize the situation was no longer about a shed. It was about control, about precedent. If they backed down now, they risked appearing weak. If they pushed forward, they risked exposing themselves to legal repercussions for attempting to enforce rules retroactively. Eventually, the president returned with a forced expression of neutrality, as though masking her irritation behind a veneer of professionalism. The board, she said, would review the documents thoroughly. They would take the matter under advisement. They would provide an official response in writing. In other words, they were delaying, not because they needed time, but because they needed a way to save face. He left the meeting quietly, aware of the eyes that followed him, some curious, some resentful, some relieved, because if he won, others might feel empowered to challenge the creeping overreach of the HOA. As he walked out into the afternoon light, he felt lighter, not victorious yet, but confident that the truth was on his side. Back home, the shed stood exactly as it had the day before, and the decades before that. The sunlight caught on its weathered boards, illuminating every nail and grain. It had endured storms, neglect, repairs, and time itself. Now it would endure bureaucracy as well. He decided to wait. He knew the board would stew over the documents, scrambling to find some way to assert authority without exposing their misstep. He expected an answer within a week, though he doubted it would be a graceful one. Days passed slowly. The neighborhood carried on with its quiet rituals. Lawnmowers humming, dogs barking, delivery vans rattling down the streets. Yet beneath the surface, tension brewed. People whispered about the confrontation. Some approached him indirectly, expressing curiosity about how the meeting went. Others distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone challenging the HOA. On the fourth day, a new envelope appeared in his mailbox. This one thicker, heavier, stamped with the same HOA emblem as before. He recognized the intent behind it immediately. The board had made a decision. But before he opened it, a breeze swept through the yard, rustling leaves and bending grass blades. The shed stood solid, an unmoving sentinel in the shifting wind. Whatever was written in that envelope would mark the beginning of the HOA's real response. Whether petty retaliation, reluctant concession, or something far more complicated, he took a breath, held the envelope in his hand, and prepared himself for the next chapter in a battle he had not chosen but refused to lose. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to be, as though the full weight of the HOA's authority, and its desperation, pressed inside it. The homeowner stood in the quiet of his kitchen before tearing it open, bracing himself for whatever strategy they had chosen. He half expected the familiar stern tone, filled with demands and deadlines. What he found instead was far more revealing. The letter was polished, overly formal, and layered with the kind of bureaucratic phrasing designed to sound reasonable while masking defensiveness. The board acknowledged receipt of his documents, noted that they had reviewed them thoroughly, and confirmed that the shed had indeed been referenced in older property surveys predating the HOA. But rather than granting a full concession, they tried to pivot. They claimed new issues had arisen, concerns about structural integrity, possible safety hazards, and ambiguous compliance with modern community standards. It was clear what they were attempting. Cornered by irrefutable evidence, they were scrambling to find another angle of attack, something that would restore even a sliver of their control. Instead of admitting they had overreached, they shifted the accusation from the shed's existence to its condition. A clever tactic, perhaps, but sloppy. He recognized their move for what it was. Retaliation dressed as due diligence. He read the letter twice, then set it aside. They were not giving up, but neither was he. Instead of responding immediately, he decided to strengthen his position further. If they wanted to question the shed's condition, he would address that too thoroughly and on his terms. He contacted a licensed home inspector with no ties to the neighborhood or the HOA, a professional whose assessment would hold up under scrutiny. The inspector arrived 2 days later, spent over an hour examining the shed from foundation to roofline, and provided a full written report. The conclusion was clear. The structure was sound for its age, stable, and posed no hazard. It needed minor maintenance at most, nothing remotely close to justification for removal. With this new document added to his growing archive, he began preparing his response. The story had expanded far beyond a simple dispute over a shed. It had evolved into a clash between history and authority, rights and overreach. He wasn't just defending wood and nails. He was defending the principle that homeowners should not be bullied into compliance with manufactured rules. Days passed as he waited for the next scheduled HOA meeting. During that time, whispers throughout the neighborhood grew louder. Word of the documents had spread, as had news of the board's hesitation to answer the challenge directly. Some residents were quietly cheering for him, feeling their own frustrations reflected in his battle. Others were nervously watching, fearful of the chaos that might unfold if the HOA's power was publicly weakened. When the evening of the meeting arrived, he felt more prepared than ever. The sky had turned dark by the time he parked outside the community center, but the air buzzed with an energy he hadn't sensed before. A handful of neighbors lingered nearby, pretending not to watch him while very clearly doing just that. The door to the meeting room was partially open, the sound of papers shuffling and hushed voices drifting through. Inside, the board members sat in their usual positions, but something was different this time. Their postures were tighter, their expressions more guarded. The HOA president seemed especially tense, her hands clasped around a pen with the rigidity of someone trying to maintain composure in the face of mounting pressure. They had expected compliance from him earlier, but now they were the ones on edge as the meeting progressed. The president eventually announced the agenda item concerning his shed. Her voice was measured but brittle, revealing the strain beneath her practiced tone. She summarized their previous claims and referenced their new concerns. It was all predictable: vague insinuations, subjective phrasing, and a desperate attempt to redirect the narrative. He waited until she finished before presenting the inspector's report. The moment the document hit the table, the shift was unmistakable. Board members leaned in, brows tightening as they skimmed through the report's clear, objective conclusions. The inspector's credentials alone were enough to undermine their latest tactic. Their fallback argument had evaporated in seconds. The HOA president paused longer than necessary before acknowledging the report. The room thickened with unspoken tension as she attempted to salvage her footing. She referenced ongoing evaluation, future guidelines, and community cohesion, but with each passing word, her authority eroded. The board could not refute the shed's age. They could not disprove its structural soundness. They could not fabricate a reason strong enough to override documented history. Eventually, they retreated into a closed-door discussion, leaving him and the few residents who had attended sitting in a strained silence. The murmur of distant conversation drifted through the thin walls. He could imagine the board's frantic whispers, their realization that the situation had slipped out of their control. When the board re-emerged, they carried themselves with forced neutrality. The president read the final decision in a monotone voice, stripped of the confidence she had once wielded. The HOA, she announced, would officially recognize the shed as a grandfathered structure. It would not be subject to removal, fines, or modification under any current or future HOA guidelines. The violation notice was voided in full. A quiet ripple ran through the room, a mix of relief, shock, and disbelief. He felt a sense of vindication wash over him, not in triumph, but in the calm satisfaction of having stood his ground. The shed had been defended not by aggression, but by truth, and the truth had won. But the story didn't end there. In the following weeks, the HOA's facade of control continued to crack. Homeowners who had long felt suffocated by petty infractions began questioning the board's decisions. Meetings grew tense as residents demanded transparency. The board struggled to reassert authority but found themselves increasingly challenged by people empowered by his victory. Rumors circulated about internal conflicts within the HOA. Some board members reportedly questioned the president's leadership. Others considered resigning. The shed dispute had become a symbol in the neighborhood, a reminder that history, evidence, and persistence were stronger than arbitrary power. Through it all, the shed remained exactly where it had always been. Its weathered boards absorbed sunlight and rain as they had for decades. It stood steady against the passage of time and the turbulence of human politics. Months later, a new envelope arrived in his mailbox. This one was thinner, softer, and noticeably humble. Inside was a letter announcing a special election for new board members, prompted by multiple resignations. The community had decided it was time for change. He folded the letter and looked out toward the backyard. Beyond the grass, the shed stood quietly, unbothered by the storm it had survived. It had outlasted boards, bylaws, and attempts at erasure. It had outlived challenges and would continue to outlive whoever sought to control it. History had spoken, not with noise, but with endurance, and in the end, the shed remained, as it always had, a testament to resilience, a record of the land's past, and a silent victory standing strong against those who tried to rewrite what already was.